we continue to see the Commission really putting big pharma over people's health. It continues to push its own proposal that is, if I can say it as bluntly as that, baked air. It's not going to change anything. But they have proposed on a WTO level. And it's even worse than that, how they can keep on pushing this position not to support the temporary waiver of intellectual property rights. We've had a resolution where indeed we very specifically as a parliament say that we should start the text-based negotiations on a temporary waiver. We've seen documents coming from diplomats where the Commission is even downplaying this resolution. So this is a blatant disrespect of democracy and of the position of the parliament, if you ask me. Germany and in particular Merkel have been very vocal against the waiver, really to protect industry. And to me, well, that's a choice that is unacceptable when there's so many people's lives at stake. But also economically, it doesn't make sense because the longer that this pandemic is going on, the longer we're going to be in a world economical crisis.
The Delta variant that was in India eventually now has taken over the entire United States, which again highlights the interconnectedness of pandemics and the self-interest that the United States has to have a waiver. And the president, in my view, has shown strong leadership on the TRIPS waiver. And he has to convince our European friends, our European allies, who are often fond of lecturing the United States about moral responsibility to live up to theirs. And this is a clear case of the moral and right thing to do and the economically smart thing to do. And I think it has to extend to therapeutics. Not only do we need a TRIPS waiver in this case, but we need to think about how can we incentivize the development and the production of medicine that actually are affecting the urgent needs of many people in the United States and around the world.
Companies who have dragged their feet for obvious reasons, their concern is maximizing profits. That's their business model. And maximizing profits means restricting supply, because by restricting supply, you increase price. And by increasing price, you increase profits. So let's be clear, what the vaccine debate waiver is about is the ability of the drug companies to exercise that monopoly power to get not just a reasonable return on their investment. Most of the investment, by the way, has been publicly provided, not privately provided. The government provided all of the basic research and much of the money that went to bring the basic research to the market. So they're getting amply compensated for their investments. What they want, obviously, is monopoly returns. We're not putting a good face on democracy when we say our democracies put profits over lives. This is not a change in the intellectual property framework, and it's only a change in an attempt to lower the transaction cost in response to the exigencies, the urgency of the moment. But the second point I would say is the most important aspect in many ways of globalization is a globalization of knowledge. And it was the international community working together that produced the vaccines. Governments around the world that provided the money that discovered DNA. It was particularly money in the United States, University of Pennsylvania, that discovered the basics of mRNA vaccines. Hungarian working in America. It was a Turk working in Germany with support from the German government that helped develop the biotech version of the vaccine. But in the United States, Moderna, several of the critical patents are held by the US government, and it's not charging for those patents. So this has been an international effort of people from all over the world. The scientists have really cooperated on this. And that's the nature of what good science is really about. Knowledge is the fundamental public good, and addressing the problem of pandemics, public health, is also a fundamental public good. The major problem we face today is the lack of supply to ramp up the production. I believe the markets are able to do that. Anybody who says that the market can't produce syringes or glass vials or the ingredients that make up a vaccine is really expressing a lack of confidence in the market. And so there's an irony about people who say they believe in markets, but then saying, oh, there are these fundamental bottlenecks. They really are saying they don't believe in markets. Many people in Germany say, and in Europe say, the fundamental problem is the ability of developing countries or other countries to produce the vaccine. If they really believe that, then let there be access to intellectual property rights and there will be no consequences. But they are intellectually incoherent in saying there'll be disastrous consequences of the waiver, and at the same time saying the waiver won't do any good. You can't have it both ways, and they have a kind of intellectual incoherence that I find deeply troubling. But we have to remember, the longer the disease festers, the higher the probability that there will be a mutation, which is more deadly, more contagious, or more vaccine resistant. It is not in our self-interest that we allow this disease to fester. So what makes me so angry is it is a kind of example of short-sighted selfishness, that it is not in the interest of Europe, it's not in the interest of Germany, it's not in the interest of the United States that so many people not have access to the vaccine. This is an emergency, and let's not fight over what is the critical bottleneck. Let's do everything as quickly as we can to make sure that every possible bottleneck is simultaneously being addressed. And there's no doubt that intellectual property is one of the bottlenecks that has to be removed. And it's the one thing that the market can't do. The market can solve other problems, but it can't solve this problem.
If you have a waiver where intellectual property is not an issue, we might expect improvements, cheaper versions of the technology, workarounds to happen in a way that's not chilled or controlled by the IP holder. We are inevitably building technological resilience for the future. The EU document, I believe, I think it's quite performative. It's performative because in large part, it states the obvious. It's also very reductive, I think, as a proposal, because it equates the whole logic of the waiver to compulsory licenses on patents. I think it's also selective in the sense that it ignores the very real problems we have with compulsory licenses under the Doha arrangement.
The last 18 months or so have been incredibly disappointing. So on the one hand, so the global citizens are bearing the burdens of deaths of loved ones, of injured people, of devastating economies, effects on employment, healthcare, school education, etc., etc. And yet, on one hand, we have this situation. On the other, we have shareholder capitalism, hyper shareholder capitalism, which has nothing to do with social conscience whatsoever. If we look briefly at the example of, say, penicillin in the early 1940s, the necessary sort of rapid scale-up in manufacturing was an urgent situation because of the Second World War. So the US government, we need to supply vast amounts of penicillin to people who need it. How do we do this? Well, what they did was government brought together industry and universities, and they pooled their knowledge. They shared their know-how. They pooled their knowledge. And ironically, it's out of that situation that Pfizer turned into a major corporation. It was because of penicillin that Pfizer became a major corporation through the sharing of know-how. That's one of those historical facts. But then, so what happens in the 1980s? Is that shareholder capitalism becomes hyper shareholder capitalism. Managers have one obligation and one obligation only, and that is to maximize shareholder value. That's their job. That's all they have to do. Social responsibility, human rights, no, that's nothing to do with it. How do we convince governments, policymakers that shareholder maximization as the ethos of industry is actually dangerous? It is lethal. It's just lethal in a pandemic, and we really need to act on this. It's lethal in a pandemic. We cannot afford it